Imagine giving everything you have, 10 years of your life, your time, your energy, only to have it handed to someone who wasn't even there when it mattered. That's exactly what happened to me. I carried my parents, I sacrificed my own life, and then they handed it all to my sister who'd only just returned. But what she got wasn't what she expected. Stay with me, because the truth she uncovered changed everything, and it could change the way you think about family, loyalty, and justice. Don't blink, because this story is about power, betrayal, and the ultimate revenge. 10 years can erase a woman without anyone noticing. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, through choices that look noble on the surface and deadly underneath. I became the daughter who stayed, not because I was stronger than my sister, but because someone had to be. Responsibility chose me, and once it did, it never let go. Every day began with other people's needs. Medications laid out before sunrise. Appointments scheduled around my work hours. Bills sorted, negotiated, delayed, paid. I learned the language of insurance codes and hospital waiting rooms. I memorized doctors' names better than my own ambitions. My life was reduced to maintenance, keeping everything from falling apart while quietly falling apart myself. Caregiving isn't heroic when you live it. It's repetitive, draining, and invisible. No one applauds consistency. People thank you once, then assume you'll always be there. I became reliable to the point of erasure. My exhaustion was expected. My availability was assumed. My sacrifice was no longer seen as sacrifice, it was treated as duty. Financial responsibility tightened around my neck like a silent contract I never signed. I rerouted my paychecks toward survival instead of growth. Savings became emergencies waiting to happen. I postponed promotions because flexibility mattered more than money. I turned down opportunities that required distance, risk, or time. Luxuries I couldn't afford because someone else's stability depended on my presence. Emotionally, the cost was heavier. I absorbed fear that wasn't mine, anger that couldn't be expressed, grief that had no outlet. I learned to stay calm while everything shook, to listen without being heard, to comfort without being comforted. Strength became my personality, not because I wanted it to be, but because weakness was not an option. And the cruel truth is this: the more you give, the less people value it. Familiarity breeds entitlement. 10 years of showing up became the baseline. I wasn't praised because praise is reserved for what's rare, not what's dependable. My sister's absence made her interesting. My presence made me invisible. I watched my identity shrink to a role. Not a daughter with dreams, but a caretaker with obligations. Not a woman with a future, but a solution to everyone else's problems. I learned to measure my worth by how smoothly things ran, by how little anyone noticed my effort. There were nights I sat alone, wondering when it would be my turn. When someone would ask how I was doing, and mean it. When sacrifice would be acknowledged, not assumed. But those questions stayed unanswered, because asking for recognition felt selfish in a world that trained me to believe endurance was love. The years blurred together. Birthdays passed quietly. Friendships faded. I became skilled at saying, maybe later, until later no longer felt real. Dreams don't die dramatically. They starve. And mine starved while I was busy keeping everyone else alive and comfortable. The most damaging part wasn't the workload. It was the silence around it. The absence of gratitude. The lack of memory. The way my contributions disappeared the moment they became expected. I wasn't seen as generous, I was seen as available. And availability, when abused, becomes a liability instead of a gift. I told myself it would be worth it. That loyalty would protect me. That family would remember. But sacrifice without acknowledgement doesn't build bonds. It builds resentment and imbalance. It creates a hierarchy where one person gives and others receive, and eventually, the giver is taken for granted. 10 years of silent sacrifice taught me a brutal lesson. Love does not guarantee fairness. And being indispensable does not make you valued. It makes you exploitable. By the time I realized that, I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Tired of being strong. Tired of being responsible. Tired of carrying weight that was never meant to be carried alone. My silence had been mistaken for consent. My loyalty had been mistaken for obligation. And that is how a decade disappears, not with gratitude, not with honor, but with quiet expectation, until the woman holding everything together finally understands that if she keeps carrying, no one else ever will. The moment she returned, everything changed. Not because she had earned it, not because she had proven herself, but simply because absence made her glow brighter than my years of constant presence. My sister Lena had been gone for over a decade, chasing freedom, adventure, and self-interest. She had no knowledge of the bills I had paid, the crises I had navigated, the nights I had stayed awake to ensure my parents were safe. Her absence was her armor. It shielded her from hardship, from responsibility, from the invisible labor that had consumed me. And that same absence made her suddenly brilliant in everyone's eyes. People confuse rarity with value. They mistake charm for character and ease for virtue. Lena stepped into the house and was met with smiles, praise, and immediate trust. She had no scars of sacrifice, no hands calloused from relentless work, no nights haunted by worry. And that made her seem perfect. She had a lightness I could no longer afford. My consistent presence, my years of tireless work faded into the background like wallpaper, expected, ignored, unnoticed. Praise flowed toward her effortlessly. Every laugh she offered was interpreted as warmth. Every suggestion she made was treated like wisdom. Every casual gesture was celebrated as generosity. She had returned with nothing but her presence, yet suddenly she was the hero. They spoke of her as if she had carried the household on her shoulders all along, while my decade of tireless labor was reduced to the invisible norm. It was surreal to watch. 10 years of invisible sacrifice were outweighed by a single week of carefully timed charm. I realized then that families don't always reward effort, they reward convenience, novelty, and the comfort of illusion. Lena's entitlement was reinforced by their perception. She was praised not because she deserved it, but because she had returned at the right time, in the right light, to a family conditioned to forget, who had truly held everything together. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. Anger at the unfairness of it, disbelief at how quickly people could rewrite the story of a decade, exhaustion from carrying the memory of every crisis while she was celebrated for arriving after the fact. It was a painful contrast, the invisible worker who had sustained the family versus the absent sister who was lauded for merely stepping in. This favoritism wasn't malicious, it was naive, automatic, and culturally conditioned. They didn't see the years I had invested, they only saw the rarity of someone showing up and looking unburdened. Lena became the golden child because she was light where I was heavy. She became the celebrated daughter because she had nothing to carry, nothing to prove, and nothing that demanded their recognition of effort. The lesson was bitter. Consistency is invisible. Absence, however, is remarkable. Loyalty is assumed, novelty is valued. And when someone has spent a decade silently holding everything together, they can suddenly feel like a ghost in their own life, their work unrecognized, their worth underestimated. Lena's return taught me that people don't always reward endurance or character, they reward appearance and timing. Her entitlement blossomed instantly because of perception alone, while my decade of labor was erased. That is the cruel reality. The one who sacrifices most often receives least in recognition. And sometimes, the most powerful lesson comes not from trying to fight for that recognition, but from choosing when to withdraw entirely, leaving others to face the consequences they so eagerly embraced. The betrayal was surgical. It didn't come with a dramatic argument or a loud confrontation. It came quietly, almost ceremoniously, in a decision presented as final and benevolent. My parents, the people I had devoted a decade of my life to supporting, transferred everything, authority, property, and control without discussion, without acknowledgement, without even a hint of gratitude. They handed the keys, the power of attorney, and the house to Lena, as if my years of tireless work had never existed. That was the essence of ultimate betrayal, the erasure of one person's sacrifice in favor of another's sudden return. There was no consultation, no recognition of the battles I had fought for them, The late nights, the financial juggling, the personal dreams I had postponed. The decision was made unilaterally, and its presentation made clear that my opinions, my contributions, and my loyalty were irrelevant. The implication was unmistakable. The daughter who had stayed, who had carried the family through storms, was replaceable. The betrayal was deeper than the transfer of property. Property can be reclaimed, power can be contested. But the emotional betrayal, the sense of invisibility, of being undervalued by the people I had loved and served, was far more corrosive. Every document handed to Lena was a silent statement: your loyalty was assumed, your endurance taken for granted, your identity reduced to utility. They had normalized my sacrifice to the point of erasure. It was a betrayal built on selective memory. They remembered my presence, but only insofar as it served them. The 10 years of midnight worry, financial risk, and emotional labor were conveniently forgotten. They focused on Lena's return, romanticized her absence, and rewarded it with everything I had silently held together. There was no fairness in this, no recognition of effort, no acknowledgement of who had truly kept the household intact. I realized that loyalty does not guarantee gratitude, and love does not guarantee fairness. Family ties, it seemed, could be wielded to obscure debts owed and replace responsibility with favoritism. I had believed that a decade of consistent devotion would secure me a place of respect. I had been wrong. Silence had been interpreted as consent. Sacrifice had been interpreted as obligation. My parents' betrayal was complete. They had used my presence to maintain stability, then handed the rewards to someone else without hesitation. This was a betrayal not just of me, but of trust. It was a lesson in the limits of expectation. Even parents, the people we assume will honor our efforts, can choose convenience over justice. They had chosen an easy story, a narrative in which the absent child is celebrated, and the ever-present one is disregarded. And in doing so, they forced me to confront a painful truth: recognition is not owed, and loyalty is not always rewarded. The sting of this betrayal ignited something in me, not rage, not despair, but clarity. I understood that continuing to fight for acknowledgement from those who had already decided not to give it would be futile. True power, I realized, lies in choice. I could accept this erasure, or I could reclaim my dignity by stepping away. The ultimate betrayal, then, became a catalyst. It revealed who valued me, who respected me, and who merely used me. By the time the transfer was complete, I had already prepared my next move. I would leave the authority, the property, and the responsibility to Lena, but I would do so on my terms. I would not beg. I would not argue. I would demonstrate that betrayal does not weaken the betrayed. It can strengthen the one who refuses to be diminished. The crushing betrayal was theirs, but the power to respond belonged to me. In the end, the betrayal taught the harshest lesson: endurance and loyalty are invisible until they are absent. Respect is not inherited, it is earned. And when the person who held everything finally decides to step aside, the very weight that was taken for granted falls entirely on those who never bore it before. That is the ultimate measure of consequence, and the most profound form of justice. The moment had arrived, and I knew exactly what I would do. They were expecting a storm, shouts, tears, pleading, chaos, but I gave them none of it. I had spent a decade being strong for everyone else, absorbing frustration, navigating crises, and solving problems no one else wanted to touch. I had earned the right to respond not with desperation, but with control. Calm, deliberate, unwavering control. The decision my parents had made was final in their eyes. The house, the accounts, the power of attorney, all handed over to my sister, the one who had returned for only a week. And yet, in that room, I held more power than anyone understood. I walked slowly to the table, each step precise. My hands did not tremble, my voice did not waver, and my chest, though heavy with years of burden, remained steady. I placed the power of attorney documents down with a soft, but unmistakable authority. Every crease in the paper held a decade of decisions, a decade of accountability, a decade of life spent ensuring the household functioned without collapsing. By setting it down, I was not surrendering, I was transferring responsibility in a way that spoke louder than words ever could. I didn't need to argue to prove my point. The gesture itself was final, clean and undeniable. Then came the keys. The weight of them was literal and metaphorical. Keys are not just metal, they are trust, authority, control. For 10 years, those keys had opened doors I carried on my shoulders. They had given me access to every part of the house, every account, every secret worry, every financial detail. And now I handed them over calmly, deliberately, without hesitation. The action itself was louder than any confrontation. They could hear my silence echo in the room louder than they could hear me scream. The calmness in my movement was unsettling to them because it was so unexpected. People anticipate fury, they anticipate drama. They never anticipate quiet decisiveness from someone they believed powerless. I didn't look for validation from my parents. I didn't demand acknowledgement or gratitude. I had given years without asking for reward, and I would not seek reward now. My dignity was my own. By refusing to argue, I denied them the satisfaction of conflict. By refusing to beg, I refused to participate in the false narrative that my worth depended on their approval. Every act of quiet defiance, every measured gesture, communicated more than words ever could. I was choosing myself. I was drawing a line between exploitation and respect, between obligation and autonomy. They were stunned. My mother's approving nod and her words, "She deserves it," were meant to affirm my sister's position, to reinforce the narrative that the absent daughter was the preferred one. But my calm exit had already shattered that illusion. By not reacting emotionally, I denied them the satisfaction of framing me as the angry, ungrateful child. There was no room for debate. My composure spoke of strength, experience, and boundaries, and that truth is more frightening than any outburst. Calm leaves no cracks to exploit, it offers no ammunition. It forces others to confront reality. The person they underestimated is fully aware of their worth and fully willing to remove themselves from situations that no longer serve them. Walking away without drama is a power few understand. It requires a mastery of oneself that comes from years of struggle, endurance, and patience. I had learned to hold back my voice, to suppress my tears, to swallow my anger, all while making sure everyone else's life functioned smoothly. That discipline became my weapon. I did not need to scream to be heard. I did not need to argue to be understood. Every step I took toward the door communicated clarity, the decade of labor, the constant vigilance. The emotional investment, it had been mine, and I was no longer offering it freely to people who had decided to take it for granted. There was no hesitation in my movements, because hesitation invites challenge. There was no explanation, because explanations are for people who refuse to see truth without hearing it in a particular way. My calm exit carried consequences that words alone could not convey. By leaving the room with dignity intact, I allowed the weight of responsibility to land where it truly belonged. The system I had maintained for 10 years, the schedules, the bills, the legal responsibilities, would now fall entirely on those who claimed entitlement without preparation. The irony was deliberate. The calmness of my exit was the loudest statement I could make. People expect anger from betrayal. They expect tears from disappointment. They expect pleas from abandonment. By defying those expectations, I exposed their assumptions as weaknesses. They had counted on my dependency, on my willingness to fight for recognition, on my need for approval. By walking away without engaging in any of these predictable reactions, I left them to face reality unassisted. The structure they relied upon for comfort and order was no longer propped up by me. I did not feel remorse. I did not feel victory in the sense of revenge. What I felt was clarity, the satisfaction of knowing that my boundaries were respected by my own choices, and that my life would no longer be dictated by the exploitation of my loyalty. The calm exit is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of self-preservation and empowerment. It is the final acknowledgement that the person who has always carried the weight is the only one who can choose when to set it down. By leaving the power of attorney and keys behind, I transferred authority but not influence. I left a legacy of accountability for those who had chosen entitlement over gratitude. I walked away with my integrity intact, my dignity preserved, and my independence reclaimed. And in that absence, I planted the seeds of consequence that would grow precisely because I had refused to participate in the drama they expected. There is a rare strength in choosing exit over conflict. The calm exit is an unspoken language of power. It communicates resolve, teaches accountability, and delivers justice without malice. I did not need to shout to be heard. I did not need to strike to be feared. My composure was more potent than any argument, more lasting than any confrontation. By stepping away, I reclaimed control over my life and handed responsibility to those who had insisted on entitlement without understanding cost. That moment, that simple act of placing down the documents and the keys, was transformative. It was the culmination of a decade of invisible labor, the assertion of autonomy, and the quiet administration of accountability. My calm exit demonstrated that strength is not always loud, and that power is most effective when wielded with purpose, precision, and dignity. In the silence that followed my departure, the consequences I had long anticipated began to unfold, and the truth became undeniable. Respect is earned. Responsibility is heavy, and the one who has carried the weight longest holds the final word. The letter was my silent weapon, my final act of strategy, and the most devastating articulation of truth I could offer without raising my voice. It was written not in anger, but in clarity, with every sentence deliberately designed to reveal the consequences my family had ignored while celebrating Lena's return. The moment they thought the story had ended, the moment I had quietly walked away with dignity, they believed they were in control. But control is only an illusion when the person you underestimated has already anticipated every move. The letter laid bare the legal obligations tied to the house, the financial responsibilities that came with ownership, and the moral weight of caretaking that had been transferred without consideration. It was precise, methodical, and unrelenting. Every paragraph was a mirror, reflecting their ignorance and entitlement. I detailed the loans, deferred bills, ongoing medical payments, and the sheer complexity of what they assumed was a simple inheritance. I documented the exact scope of responsibilities I had carried for years, showing that ownership without knowledge is perilous, and entitlement without preparation is unsustainable. This letter was not written to punish but to expose. It forced Lena, and by extension, my parents, to confront the reality that the life they were so eager to claim was built on years of silent labor that could not simply be handed over. By the time she read it, the illusion of reward shattered. Every number, every clause, every fact was indisputable. The letter transformed their sense of victory into panic, turning the celebration of inheritance into an urgent reckoning. It was the culmination of all my years of foresight, a carefully orchestrated revelation that exposed both the legal and emotional consequences of taking without understanding, and it did so without ever raising my voice. The strategic letter revealed a harsh truth: entitlement has limits when responsibility cannot be ignored. Lena had thought she was stepping into privilege, into comfort, into a reward she had earned merely by returning. But the letter dismantled that illusion systematically. It reminded her that the house was not just a space but a living, breathing financial organism, dependent on constant attention, management, and decisions that could not be postponed. Every bill, repair, and administrative decision was now hers, and the protection she had taken for granted, my presence, was gone. The letter also imposed a moral reckoning, the recognition that care is not transferred with property, that love and inheritance are separate, and that the labor I had sustained could not be substituted by presence alone. Every factual detail underscored the magnitude of her oversight. By the time she finished reading, panic had replaced pride. Confusion replaced confidence. The privilege she assumed was inescapably intertwined with obligations she had neither prepared for nor anticipated. This letter was more than communication. It was accountability delivered on paper, a reminder that invisibility in labor does not make effort inconsequential. And that complacency and entitlement carry consequences that are unavoidable once the one who sustained the system steps aside. It was the ultimate strategies, a demonstration that the most effective revenge is not emotional, but precise, revealing truth in its raw, undeniable form, ensuring that when the illusion collapsed, it did so with irreversible clarity. The impact of the letter was both immediate and enduring. Lena, previously arrogant and confident, was confronted with the enormity of responsibility she had claimed with ease. She realized that inheritance was not a gift of comfort. It was a weight she had underestimated. Each paragraph revealed a layer of complexity that had been invisible to someone who had never carried the burden. She had believed in the simplicity of reward, but the letter turned that assumption upside down. It exposed every risk, every pending obligation, every detail that my years of labor had shielded from view. By forcing her to confront reality, the letter became a turning point, a recalibration of her understanding, and a reassertion of my presence in the story, even as I had physically removed myself from the household. This strategic letter exemplified the ultimate lesson in preparation and foresight. Years of silent sacrifice allowed me to anticipate every loophole, every hidden risk, every point where entitlement could clash with reality. By crafting a document that encapsulated all of this, I ensured that when the time came to relinquish control, the consequences would not be vague or negotiable. Responsibility could not be ignored, and entitlement could not shield ignorance. The letter made it clear that inheritance without preparation is a trap, and it exposed the fragile foundation upon which my family had attempted to base their assumptions of reward. It was precise, devastating, and morally undeniable, a testament to the power of planning, patience, and the understanding that justice need not scream to be heard. Ultimately, the strategic letter was my final act of empowerment. It was a demonstration of foresight, intelligence, and moral clarity. While my family believed the confrontation was over, the letter ensured that the repercussions of their choices could no longer be ignored or misunderstood. It was calculated, undeniable, and precise. The kind of revenge that leaves no room for argument, no space for denial, and no refuge for entitlement. And in its quiet potency lay the ultimate truth. Those who have carried the weight longest often have the clearest understanding of the consequences. And when they choose to reveal that understanding, it is both transformative and inescapable. The moment Lena opened the letter, the illusion she had been living in began to crumble. She had walked into the house expecting applause, congratulations, and admiration, believing that the inheritance she claimed was a reward for mere presence. She had imagined comfort, authority, and privilege awaiting her, all without effort or preparation. But the letter shattered that fantasy in an instant. Every legal detail, every financial obligation, every moral responsibility was now starkly clear. She realized that what she had thought was a gift was actually a burden she had never earned and could not manage. Panic replaced pride. Confidence dissolved into confusion. The privileges she had assumed were meaningless in the face of real responsibilities. The house was no longer a symbol of success, it was a liability. The accounts were no longer a simple inheritance, they were complex systems requiring attention, knowledge, and judgment she did not possess. The medical care, the deferred bills, the obligations I had absorbed for 10 years, all now demanded her immediate and competent action. Her sense of entitlement, built on the comfort of my labor and absence of accountability, collapsed under the weight of reality. Her screams, disbelief, and anger were immediate, but they could not alter the facts laid out in the letter. She had expected reward without work, recognition without effort, and authority without responsibility. The strategic revelations forced her to confront the consequences of her assumptions. Her sense of entitlement, once reinforced by family approval and perception, was dismantled systematically, exposing the fragility of a privilege that had never been earned. She had gained control, yes, but only over a system that was complex, demanding, and unforgiving, a system she had neither prepared for nor respected. The collapse was not just emotional, it was existential. Lena had built her identity on being the golden child, the favored one, the returnee who would inherit admiration and material reward. That identity was now incompatible with reality. The letter, combined with my calm withdrawal, forced her to recognize the truth: inheritance is meaningless without capability. Authority is meaningless without accountability, and entitlement is meaningless without preparation. She had inherited nothing of value without the labor that sustained it. And that realization struck harder than any confrontation could. The consequences were immediate. The household that had operated smoothly under my guidance began to reveal cracks in her management. Decisions she delayed or ignored resulted in pressure and urgency she could not contain. Every minor mistake amplified the sense of collapse, reinforcing the lesson that entitlement without work is unstable and temporary. She learned that inheritance is not a reward for being present. It is the responsibility to manage, maintain, and uphold what others built. What she thought she had won as a prize was, in fact, a weight she was unprepared to bear. This collapse of entitlement also revealed the personal costs of her absence. She saw, perhaps for the first time, what she had lost: respect for herself, confidence earned through effort, an understanding of the sacrifices required to sustain a household. Her illusion of reward and ease collided violently with reality, creating a crisis she had never anticipated. She had assumed that family love and recognition would protect her from consequences. She learned, belatedly, that love and inheritance do not absolve responsibility. The collapse was both immediate and instructive. It forced Lena to acknowledge that privilege alone is insufficient to navigate life's complexities. It highlighted the depth of my sacrifice, the foresight embedded in my actions, and the inevitability of accountability. By removing myself from the system and exposing the realities through the letter, I ensured that she could no longer rely on perception, charm, or absence to maintain her assumed position. Entitlement, left unchecked by experience and preparation, is doomed to fail, and that failure was now undeniable. In the end, her explosion, panic, and despair were the natural culmination of her illusions crashing against reality. The inheritance she celebrated was simultaneously a reward and a reckoning, a test she was unprepared to pass. The collapse of her entitlement served as a reminder that labor, foresight, and endurance cannot be bypassed. It underscored the quiet power of those who bear responsibility and the consequences that inevitably follow when entitlement is mistaken for capability. Her lesson was irrevocable. Inheritance without preparation is perilous, and privilege without understanding is unsustainable. What she gained was responsibility. What she lost was ignorance, comfort, and the illusion of effortless reward. And as I watched from the margins, calm and composed, I understood that the most potent form of justice is not confrontation or anger. It is letting reality teach its own lessons, one consequence at a time, until the illusion finally shatters completely. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or taken for granted, this story is for you. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't shouting or fighting, it's calm strategy and letting the truth speak for itself. If you want more stories of real strength, justice, and the unshakable power of one woman who refuses to be ignored, hit that subscribe button and join our family. Trust me, you don't want to miss the next one. Stay strong, stay fearless, and always stand for yourself.